and filtering them ready for the end of the evening. Oh, and also it's going to be recorded this evening, as you may have just spotted. And we'll also be filtering out some key takeaways that will be collated into a slide deck, which we will email out shortly after this evening's event. I now wish to introduce our chair for the evening, Heidi Alexander. Heidi was appointed as Sadiq Khan's Deputy Mayor of Transport in June 2018. Before joining the Mayor's team, Heidi was the Member of Parliament for Lewisham East from 2010 to 2018. She served in the Whip's office before being appointed as Shadow Secretary of State for Health. Between 2006 and 2010, Heidi worked as Deputy Mayor of the London Borough of Lewisham and Cabinet Member for Regeneration. And we are delighted to have her with us this evening. And without further ado, I will pass over to Heidi. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amy, and good evening, everyone. A huge thank you to Labour Cycles for organising this event this evening. It's really nice to be able to have virtual fringes, even when we're not able to be together in person. So I think it looks like a really, really good event. I'm not going to take up a lot of time because I think the panellists and the people that you're going to be hearing from this evening are all real experts in their field. And so I just want to make a few very short opening remarks, and then we'll move straight on to some of the really interesting speakers that we've got lined up. For me personally, I think it's such a nice change to be able to spend an hour thinking creatively about the way that we could do things differently to make sure that streets and places can be enjoyed by everyone, irrespective of their gender, that our streets and our urban areas can be places where everyone feels safe, where they feel comfortable, where they can be happy and energised. And in my role, I'm just thinking about the fact that this morning I spent 3 hours on the TfL, Transport for London Finance Committee, which isn't an easy subject at the best of times, but is a particularly challenging subject at the moment. So I think it's really important that politicians, especially when things are really difficult in local government at the moment, are able to lift their eyes to the horizon and actually use this sort of moment of reset as we come out of the pandemic to think about how we can do things differently. I think the design gap and how we make our streets and urban spaces better for everyone, particularly for women, is a subject that doesn't really get the attention that it deserves. Having said that, I think over the last year, we have started to see more public engagement on the issue than we have previously. So if we think about the horrific circumstances around the disappearance and what we now know to be murder of Sarah Everard, and the outcry from women about being able to feel safe and be safe on their streets, it was often talked about that women wanted to reclaim their streets, and that made me feel slightly uncomfortable. I just want to feel ownership over our public spaces in the same way as men do. But it struck me that it really led to a lot of moments of reflection for women. And I found myself certainly thinking about some of the ingrained behaviours that I don't reflect upon normally, but things that I do as a result of the way in which streets and town centres are designed, areas that you might think, well, I'm not going to go down there because there's not a lot of people, I don't feel safe, the lighting's not great. And actually, I think a lot of us perhaps don't spend every waking hour thinking about those things, but the horrific murder of Sarah Everard and the fact that the circumstances of her disappearance obviously led us all to ask ourselves some pretty deep questions about that. I also think the debates about low traffic neighbourhoods, about school streets, we've often seen women at the forefront of those campaigns for change, which has been a really good thing. And we've seen a lot of really strong women actually standing up and continuing to make the arguments as to why reducing rat running through traffic on our local roads, reducing road danger is something that is really important to the communities that we live in. And I think during lockdown as well, we've all started to look at the areas that we live in through a new pair of eyes, haven't we? I know I've noticed things about the streets on which I live, because I've spent so much more time here over the last 15 months than things that I would have noticed previously. So I think this is really timely. I think it's a really important moment that we are asking ourselves what we can all do together to design our streets and town centres better. I'm going to leave my remarks there because we've got a brilliant expert in the field, Professor Rachel Aldred, who's going to kick us off with a little bit of a presentation this evening. I'm sure Rachel will be very familiar to lots of you. I know I often quote her research when I'm being asked questions about issues such as low traffic neighbourhoods. So I'm just going to hand straight over to Rachel. Rachel's a Professor of Transport and is Director of the Active Travel Academy at the University of Westminster. So over to Rachel.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Heidi. And yeah, very, very pleased to be here. I've been asked to say a bit about some of the background data around access to active travel and cars. And I've kind of highlighted that there is not just one gender gap, but a series of gender gaps. And for me, this is some really important reasons why it's a social justice issue, that, you know, we are able to create better environments for walking and cycling and reallocate space from motor traffic. So I am going to start off with saying something about cycling. So cycling in this country, as people may know, is a very sort of minority and marginalised form of transport. Cycling makes up 2% of all trips made. So this is a very small minority, but it's very skewed within that. So it's skewed by gender. So the Department for Transport Statistics are showing us that men make 3 times as many cycle trips as women and cycle almost 4 times further. Now that kind of sounds impressive, but remember that only a small minority of men are cycling. This is something that most people don't feel able to do. And when we look at the relationship between cycling levels and cycling equity, we find a really strong relationship. So I was recently involved in a co-authored paper that looked across 17 countries and looked at levels of cycling in relation to who was cycling in terms of gender and age. And the pattern is really clear. And unfortunately, we are at the bottom left-hand side of that curve. You know, places where cycling is seen as, you know, a hostile, a scary thing to do are also places with very few women cycling, often very few older people and children cycling. You know, when we create those kind of environments that are welcoming for all, we get, in some cases, more women than men cycling. We get many older people cycling, we get many children cycling. And I wouldn't interpret this chart as, well, let's just increase cycling and then the problems will be solved. I'd turn it around and say we're not going to get mass cycling without focusing on women, older people, children, and making sure that we build for what they need. And I'll return to that at the end. When we look at walking, we have other problems, also, you know, a gendered mode of transport. So there's a lot more walking at the moment in this country than there is cycling. And women walk slightly more than men, 206 miles a year compared to 203 miles a year. But that doesn't mean that, you know, the problem is solved by a long way. So firstly, one of the things that I've been really interested to find in my research is the scope for more walking. So, you know, walking is good for us, walking is good for well-being. It should be good for well-being. It should be something that people can do sociably, that can be pleasant. And we find that when conditions are improved for walking, we found a substantial increase in walking. So, you know, that may look like quite a lot compared to cycling, but there's a scope for a lot more if we change the conditions for walking. And at the moment, you know, just because people are walking, it doesn't mean that they're having a pleasant experience, that they are getting those well-being benefits, particularly people, you know, for instance, traveling with children, which is more likely to be women. So these kind of environments, you know, people may feel willing to walk because there is a footway. They feel that they can have some level of separation from motor traffic, but, you know, you can't stay on the footway all the time. You have to interact with motor traffic. You often have to have these kind of unpleasant experiences. And there's a lot of literature, particularly from lower and middle income countries, about some of these issues. And obviously, you know, maybe our walking environments are better than some of those examples, but we certainly have a lot of anti-pedestrian infrastructure, as they call it in Mexico, in terms of, for instance, you know, bridges. We make pedestrians go up and round and back. You know, we make pedestrians go the long way around, and we create, you know, shortcuts for motorized traffic. And as the Inter-American Developmental Bank points out, you know, captive walkers, people who have no choice, you know, they're not getting those well-being benefits. They're having these safety risks, they're having unpleasant experiences, they're having environmental risks. And quite sensibly, you know, many people who have those experiences would think, well, I don't want to be walking, you know, the environment is not prioritizing me as a pedestrian. And this is actually what got me into transport, was walking around some of these kind of environments where you see the A12, you see the space taken up for motor vehicles. As a pedestrian, you cannot cross that. You know, you have 6 lanes of motor traffic and a barrier. And I spent quite a lot of time walking through that subway, and you can imagine how welcoming that is at night as well. You know, that is, you can't walk across that road, you are forced underground. So these kind of experiences, these kind of environments, people may walk because they have no choice, but, you know, it's a social justice issue to make it something that they enjoy, that they get those benefits they should be getting from walking. I also wanted to move on to talk about car access, because for me as well, thinking about this social justice angle. So for walking, as I was saying, you know, many people, you know, if you don't have access to a car, if you can't afford public transport, you walk potentially because you have no choice. And yet your experience is often, you know, that you're a second-class citizen. For people in relation to cycling, for, you know, women and men who don't feel that they can cycle, you know, very often if you don't have access to those other modes, you're missing out. You're missing out on something that is a healthy, a low cost, you know, a good form of transport if you don't have access to that. So I wanted to finish by saying something about the gendering of access to cars and who has access to cars and who doesn't. So first of all, women generally have lower access to cars than men, but it's really interesting when you look at different groups of women, and I'm going to keep this brief, but you could obviously, you know, you could look at this in a lot more depth and detail, but I just want to give you a few examples, which is interesting to think about. So when we use census data and we look across England and Wales, we can see that 21% of female residents live in a household without a car, compared to 18% of male residents. So there is a gap. I mean, it doesn't look like it's a 3% gap, so it's not a huge gap. But when we compare different groups, we see that gap, you know, the rates of living in households without a car go up, and we see that gap increase. So for instance, if we look at disabled people whose day-to-day activity, who report their day-to-day activity is limited a lot, that's 43% of women living in a household without a car and 34% of those men. So that's why I refer to gender gaps, because there are different gender gaps, there are differences between different groups of women when you're looking at different forms of transport, when you're looking at access to cars, for instance. Household structure is also something that's really interesting to look at. So I also used census data, a different data set, to look at household structure and car availability. So overall, if we look at the household level, 26% of households in England and Wales don't have access to a car. But when you look at households with dependent children, there's massive variation. So if we're talking about married or civilly partnered couples with dependent children, 6% of those households don't have access to a car. But if we look at single parent households with dependent children, and these are overwhelmingly female-headed households, 41%. So very, very big differences in terms of household structure. And this is very strongly gendered as well in terms of who has access to cars. Of course, you know, when we use a gender lens, we have to look beyond the household level as well, that a household may have a car, but who within that household has access to that car, you know, who is able to use that car and when and for what will vary. So the National Travel Survey has some quite interesting data on types of driver, for instance. So among all adults, 58%, nearly 6 in 10, are main drivers, define themselves as main drivers in a household with a car. 11% are living in a household with a car, but are other drivers, so they're not the main person who drives the car. 13% are non-drivers, so there's a household car, but that person doesn't drive. And then 19%, 1 in 5, are living in car-free households. So again, there's some really interesting demographic statistics here that you can pull out. And, you know, this is very broad brush. You could go into a lot more detail. So 2/3 of adult men are main drivers, but only half of adult women. And I think this is very interesting for thinking about access, mobility, thinking potentially about how the options that people have for you know, getting about as they doing their day-to-day activities. When you look at different groups by ethnicity as well, this varies even more. So this is, as I say, very broad brush, but if you look at, say, white men, white women, Black, Asian, minority ethnic men, Black, Asian and minority ethnic women, then you see some really big gaps open up. So 69% of white men, adult white men in the survey, say they're main drivers, but only 31% of Black, Asian and minority ethnic women are main drivers. And then when you compare people living in a car-free household, that's only 14% of white men, but 30% of Black, Asian and minority ethnic women. So there's some really important gaps related to gender and, you know, other important dimensions of marginalisation and privilege when we look at access to cars. And so to conclude, just to highlight a few of the points that I've sort of skipped through. So firstly, I would say in cycling hostile contexts, we know that women cycle much less than men, but where cycling is pleasant and normal, women cycle more. Women make more innately cyclable trips than men. But when the environment is hostile, we suppress very strongly cycling among women. Women already walk more than men, but often this is in unpleasant environments. It's not necessarily a choice. So again, you know, these environments need to improve. There's also scope for getting much more walking if we improve those walking environments and therefore benefiting well-being, health, mobility and so on. Women have lower access to cars than men do. And as I was saying, gender intersects strikingly with other dimensions of privilege and marginalisation. So there's a strong social justice case, I think, for equitably investing in active travel, reallocating road space and time from cars or driving. And just the point the graph is making is that we need to think about where we build. So for instance, if we look at the types of trips people make, who makes school run trips? Well, it's overwhelmingly women. So if we don't think about trips to school, you know, if we focus only on commute trips, trips to work and not trips to school, you know, there's a gender bias in that. We need to think, for instance, about the fact that, you know, shopping trips, people make shopping trips to different kinds of places. People are not going to the same shopping centres. So we need to look at where we invest, we need to do it equitably, and we need to make sure that we prioritise people who are currently marginalised. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel. Sorry, I was rapidly reaching for my mute button and didn't quite get there quickly enough. Really, really interesting presentation of some of the data there. If you've got questions, either write them in the chat or just make a mental note, and we'll make sure that we come back to Rachel in the Q&A. Next up, we got Susan Clarice. I can see she's getting her presentation up on the screen ready. Susan is a transport planner at Arup, the consultancy, and she's also Vice President of Living Streets. I think she's going to speak to us about the way in which women have been excluded from street design in the past and what inclusive design looks like, you know, in terms of best practice. So over to Susan.
Great, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay and see the slides okay? Yeah, great stuff, good, thank you. Really pleased to be here tonight, so thank you very much for inviting me along. Why didn't that slide move? Sorry. So I guess the first question is really, are streets women friendly? Now you could say self-evidently they're not, and that's why we're having this event this evening. But I think actually if you asked a number of sort of people, they might say that actually streets are already women friendly. What is the problem? Why are we talking about this? And that's some of the things I want to talk through this evening. And I think one of the reasons why I believe women are not, why streets are not women friendly is to do with the sort of people who are employed in the planning sector and the transport sector. So if you look at women employed in the transport sector, it's about 80% men and about 20% women. So it is not representative of the general population. And there was a good article recently looking at why cities are built, for example, for 6 feet tall men. This goes back to Le Corbusier when he was designing parts of Paris in the 1940s, and the design was around the dashing British policeman was his role model, who was 6 foot tall. And so you end up with a built environment with a transport system that is designed around this type of average person who doesn't exist, doesn't exist very well anyway. And this was powerfully explored in the book Invisible Women by Caroline Criado-Perez, and the idea of reference man. And it's really around the idea that we design in our own image, which sounds a bit of a blame thing, but if you put it in another way, you can say that it's hard to design outside of our own experience. And if the people planning our towns and cities, planning our transport system, They will plan in their own image, which is why we have transport systems which are very much based on the journey to work, based on the commute, and based around a certain demographic. And it isn't just to do with transport. Many aspects of our life. You go to a hotel and try on the bathrobe and you end up with something like this. And these ideas are not new. So actually, if we go back to Jane Jacobs and her classic book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, 60 years ago now, she said then that cities have the capability of providing something for everybody only because and only when they are created by everybody. So what do women-friendly streets need? What would be different about them? I can draw on some work that was done by Arup and Sustrans looking at cycling for everyone, and Rachel mentioned how there are many underrepresented groups in cycling. And we did look specifically at women, but we looked at other demographic groups who of course also contain women, often more than half women, ethnic minority groups, groups at risk of deprivation, women, disabled people and older people. And what we found is that those groups do not associate cycling as an activity for people like them, but there's a lot of unmet demand. People would be keen to take up cycling. So our report made 3 recommendations, and I think these apply to other aspects of transport. They're not unique to cycling. The first thing is we need to increase representation in governments in decision making. And crucially, we need to embed inclusivity in walking and transport cycling strategies and plans. We do need to create better places for everyone to walk in, but also we need to welcome and we need to support all people to walk and cycle. And I think that goes from every level, from policy level in terms of having inclusive imagery, right down to the way that we actually all behave towards each other on the street. And we're following this up with a document called Walking for Everyone, working with, again, Sustrans and this time Living Streets, looking at what Rachel described as those captive walkers, because we recognise the experience of walking is not equal for everybody, although there is a lot of that lack of data. And that's looking at things like fear of attack or harassment, looking at traffic levels and speeds. There are issues around confidence, if people don't have languages of English as a first language, and if there's poor air quality. And for me, in terms of what makes women-friendly streets, people-friendly streets, I think a great starting point is the Transport for London Healthy Streets indicators, which talk about streets that are easy to cross, that are safe, but critically that people feel safe. You know, that they do need these other aspects in terms of they need to feel relaxed, they need clean air, there needs to be people from all walks of life. But I think it's this feeling of people feeling safety and perceptions that are really important. And as Heidi mentioned, this has been brought into a lot of attention this year with the events that have happened, and also with Reclaim the Streets. And I like what Heidi said about it sort of being, you know, it's ownership, it shouldn't be reclaiming. So I think the sort of things we need better seating, and I deliberately use the word seating rather than benches, because some people will feel safer on an individual seat, some people need arms either side to actually get up and down. So it's looking at different types of seating to help people and to make a good area. Crucially, and this is something that is missed off the Healthy Streets indicators, we need toilets. We really need toilets in our public area and as part of our transport system. And this is an example of a community toilet scheme in Ashford, which shows the places that you can go where you can use a toilet without having to make a purchase. So we need more toilets, but we need to make better use of the provision that we do have. We definitely need more greenery, whether that's street trees, whether that's planters. That doesn't just make streets better for women, it makes streets better for everybody. It helps in terms of sustainable urban drainage, it can help in terms of cooling, all sorts of benefits. And I think we do need low traffic neighbourhoods. So in Islington, the people-friendly streets, which I'm sure we'll be hearing more about later, or there's a picture there of Hackney as well. And it's about rebalancing streets, taking out that rat-running traffic, which makes people feel unsafe, encouraging more walking and cycling, which I think is actually crucial to people's safety. But as well as doing all those good things for walking and cycling, I think what we need to do to make streets feel safer is to address what I refer to as transport gluttony. And an example of that is pavement parking. So you can see here, these 2 photographs were taken on one of my lunchtime walks about a mile apart from each other. And the pavement parking there blocking the streets, the pavements, which makes them unusable for people. That's a problem for everybody, but a particular problem if you're a woman, if you've got children, if you're pushing a pushchair, or if you're disabled, or if you're just walking along side by side. And yes, I did get chased down the road for taking this photograph, and the person whose car it was afterwards, who couldn't believe what I was doing. I think what we need are streets that look like the one on the right, where there is seating, where there is space from parked cars, there is greenery. We need to make sure that we keep footways clear of other obstacles. How often do you see traffic signs just blocking the footway like this one was in Bloomsbury? There is an alternative. Traffic signs can be mounted on cones and placed in the highways. We need to make sure we keep our footways clear. We need slower speeds, and this is particularly affects children who find it very difficult to differentiate speeds of more than about 25 miles an hour. And also in terms of safety, if you get hit by a car doing 20 miles an hour, there's a 10% chance it will result in a fatality, but at 40 miles an hour, there's an 80% chance. So we definitely need slower speeds on our streets. And we need to stop idling engines. Good poster, I think, from TfL, which shows how much pollution an idling engine can produce in 1 minute. And there's a house just up the road from me that's been forced to put up a sign on the fence saying, no idling, please turn off engine, because it's so bad in someone's room. Again, we need to stop this sort of behaviour to make our streets more pleasant. And I think we need fewer SUVs. They don't belong in our urban areas. They are more polluting. If you are hit by an SUV, you're more likely to die, particularly if you are shorter, a woman or child, because of the part of the body that it hits. And the graph here, this is global figures, but it shows the growth in rate of SUVs, both in total and as a proportion. And the really slim slithers you see at the top there are cars electric and electric SUVs. So we can see that sales of SUVs are something like 1 in 3 vehicles in Europe at the moment, and I think that needs to be stopped. And I think we have to recognise there is a motoring mindset. These are a couple of adverts from Twitter. Why Audi did that one of let your heart beat faster with a child in front of the car like that, I have no idea. The Mercedes-Benz one in Mercedes-Benz USA, the car with 5 screens, no shortage of bright ideas. That one was actually taken down by Mercedes-Benz, but it shows the sort of mindset that there is out there. And I saw this over the weekend. This is Reference Man, well and truly alive. This is the Pedestrian Detection Advanced Driver Assist Scheme for a 2020 Toyota car. And it says the following pedestrians may not be detected. And it's if you're shorter, if you're taller, if you're pushing a pushchair, a wheelchair, or a bicycle, if it's in the dark, all of these things. It's been designed around an average, which doesn't account for the majority of people. So to conclude, I think what I want to say is that women-friendly streets are people-friendly streets, and it brings many benefits. So at Arup, we've researched work on urban childhoods and on aging communities. And if you design a street that's safe and pleasant for women to use, the chances are it will be good for children to use and for older people to use. We've just published work on queering public space and looking at how people switch or hide their identities in order to feel safe in the majority of public spaces. Again, if you design for women-friendly streets, you will be helping to design better streets for everybody. And what that means is there are many benefits in many policy areas. So this is a screenshot from the gear change document that shows the benefits in terms of health, well-being, reducing congestion, improving economic activity for local businesses, improving environment and air quality, decarbonisation and economy. So to conclude, this is from the Transportation Secretary Pete. In his words, he says that every transportation policy choice is an equity decision, whether decision makers recognise it or not. It's time to do the right thing. And for me, the right thing is having this priority on our streets where we start off reducing the need to travel. Then we have walking in its most inclusive aspect, including people wheeling, children on scooters, cycling, public transport, taxis, freight and servicing, and private vehicles at the end. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Susan. That was a really, really clear and comprehensive canter through the issues. I sort of felt like I could listen to you for like the whole of the next hour, to be honest, because I get the sense that there's a lot more detail behind the rapid fire presentation you did there. Right, we've now got contributions from 4 councillors that are really sort of at the coalface of a lot of this work at the moment. So we've got Eve from Manchester, Nalufa, I hope that I've pronounced that right, from Newham, Layla from Croydon, and Rowena from Islington. And I'm going to ask each of them just to talk about their experiences in their own local areas for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So if I can start with Councillor Eve Holt, who's a councillor at Manchester City Council. Over to you, Eve.
Great, thank you. And I'm so pleased we're having this conversation, and there's certainly a lot that can be said. So, I mean, I see my role very much as trying to influence across the multiple layers of influence on whether or not women are safe on our streets and whether they feel safe on our streets. And just as Rachel described, I see day to day these series of gender gaps And I see how these completely exacerbated and widened if you are a woman of colour, if you're a disabled woman, if you're a younger woman, older woman, and the list goes on. And I guess my job as a counsellor is often to ask the questions and to highlight what we're doing wrong, and to point to what we could be doing better. And I hold in my head a sort of mental map really of what are some of these key influences. I use a model called a socio-ecological model. There's lots of models out there, but it helps me to keep checking really against what are these multiple layers that impact. And the first one of those really is data. So I refer to Rachel a lot, because the truth is we haven't been collecting the data, have we? We haven't had good enough data. I've got Invisible Women on my bookshelf. If you haven't read it, read it, because women have been and continue to be invisible, and women in their diversity are definitely invisible. And you can see how this happens. So to give a couple of examples to bring it to life, I remember when first sat in a meeting with Chris Boardman and others about the B Network. We were all very excited. We talked about, well, who's going to design this? What are these journeys going to be? Where is it going to go? And I had a very excited response from the planners and engineers saying, well, it's great, because what we're going to do is we're going to, we've brought people together, on Saturday mornings in rooms with maps, and they're going to tell us where it is. And we've got this map online, and people have told us on this map online, and we're using Strava. And we've got these measures on our key kind of artillery routes into city centre. So we can use all that data, and that will tell us where people want to go. And I put my hand up and went, oh, there's a slight problem with that, isn't there? Are you collecting the data here to tell us, disaggregate data as to, who are these people in these rooms? Who are the people that are commenting on your maps online, and who are doing these journeys? Oh, no, we've not done that. So there was nothing there that showed us who was informing on each of those 4 different places. And what I know is that in each of those, there's less likely to be women that on a Saturday morning are going to be sat in those rooms, or that are going to be logging on to add their comments to a map, or that are going to be going on those particular journeys where they were measuring, or on Strava. So already from the very beginning, we were at risk of designing for men who were already cycling and who were doing particular journeys. So it's constantly asking this question of what data we're collecting, and for who and for what purpose. So there's, who is travelling, but also what really matters. What we hear a lot in transport is its speed of journey, and it's the distance of the journey, and it's journeys into what is perceived to be the economic centre. And actually, again, that is completely gendered. What about the joy of the journey? What about our health and well-being? What about all those brilliant things that we've just heard from Susan about how pleasant it is as an experience? If you're taking the kids to school, you're not thinking necessarily about how quickly you get there. You're also thinking about what happens, what's the conversation on the way? What do you interact with on the way? Hopefully there's play on the way, there's some joy on the way. So how are we measuring different things that are some of the key motivations for how we get around, how we feel safe? Is it creating the kind of place that we want, the kind of neighbourhood and the kind of routes? And, we're not all travelling necessarily just into the city centre. Many of us are doing those chain links that we know, that we're doing different jobs, to the shops, to care for people, to schools, to the parks, all those different journeys that we need to be taking account and designing for. So data's key. Thank you, Rachel. Keep sharing the data, and we'll keep asking for more. And then culture. So, Heidi, you referred to those ingrained behaviours. It's constantly, again, highlighted the point that misogyny that has been highlighted, we've seen the extent of that with obviously the murder of Sarah Everard. We know that is every single day there's a woman that is unsafe in her home or on her streets. And yet we know that not everybody sees or hears that or recognises that. So when I was up for re-election this year, I'd made safe streets one of my key 3 priorities, and I had male councillors saying, why is that? Because it's not a concern that I get in my inbox. Because no, they're not having women necessarily in their local area coming to them to say they feel unsafe, but as a woman, they're more likely to come to me. So again, it's making that visible, really highlighting this is an issue and something we need to do about it. And then policy. So again, really thinking about what is our vision for place? How are we making sure that all those things that we talked about a greener space, that is a pleasant space, at concepts of 20-minute neighbourhoods, and really trying to make sure that we're designing with women, that we're co-designing with them to make it clear that it suits the reality and experiences of their lives, and that then influences all those decisions around the environment, the urban design, the infrastructure, which we know currently is generally dominated by men sitting in those rooms who are designing those things with their own self in their mind, and they're not thinking about women and the kind of spaces that they want. And then it's also the organisations that we interact with. So very much thinking about schools being absolutely key, heart of the community. You know, often they are far more representative of the diversity of people locally. So by starting off working with schools within a place, I think you're far more likely to be able to design, again, for younger people, for older people, for the whole family, and in a way that absolutely works far better for women and takes into account those journeys at a neighbourhood level that are so key and where people often feel unsafe. And then just finally, really thinking about our social networks and how us as an individual. So a number of things I've been doing very practically as a counsellor was recognising that a lot of the kind of networks that are set up currently are often work with sort of male-dominated cycling clubs, for example, or they were walking groups that didn't necessarily work for women. So setting up and supporting more local, welcoming, inclusive walking and cycling groups that encourage that buddying, encourage people to go and feel safe, you know, to take ownership of our streets, to feel like it's something for them in the places that they live, and really taking that person-centred approach to recognising that actually we all have different motivations for where we want to go and how we want to get about and what makes us feel safe, and we need to listen to people and work with them throughout. So having things like we've got some funding for Now Streets projects, and I saw Claire, who's party to that, who lives locally to me, which is really about engaging with people in the community, taking time to listen to them about what matters to them, what are the things that stop them from feeling safe, really making sure we're engaging with young women, we're engaging with older women, we're engaging with women in their diversity, and that they're helping us to design a place that works for them. So lots to do. I know our time's up, but it's great to be this conversation, so thank you.
Brilliant, thanks Eve. A really, really uplifting presentation and some very powerful insights as well from your own direct experiences. I'm going to ask Niloufer to go next. Niloufer is a councillor in Newham. I hope I've got this right, Deputy Cabinet Member for Environment and Sustainable Transport. So over to you.
Sorry, my square keeps moving, so I'm going to unmute fast enough. Thank you for inviting me to be a member of the panel, such an esteemed panel. So yes, I've been a councillor since 2018, so it's just been a little over 3 years, and have been a deputy cabinet for a little over, just under a year now. So relatively new, but have vast amounts of experience in just designing streets, especially when a majority of our healthy school streets and low traffic neighbourhoods has been in the last year or so. So just Newham in the last 2 years has made it its mission to create streets that are friendly for women by improving health and well-being. A lot of our work is actually underpinned by key policy commitments, which is addressing the climate emergency, which we declared in 2019, and measuring economic success based on the health, happiness and well-being of residents, and creating 15-minute neighbourhoods in the borough. In my role as Deputy Cabinet for Environment and Sustainable Transport, I've been leading the work in creating the healthier and safer streets through the Healthy School Streets work, low traffic neighbourhoods and improvements to the public realm. I'll be spending roughly the next few minutes, hopefully I can do it within the 5 minutes allocated, by discussing the challenges that we face in Newham and what we've done to create inclusive and safer neighbourhoods. You may know that Newham has the worst air quality in the country. We were in the papers for it, with 111 deaths attributed to poor quality, air quality in the borough last year. And we have the worst asthma rates in London, with 197 children under 19 admitted to hospitals due to asthma-related conditions in 2019 to 2020. And a resident survey conducted in 2019 found that women are more likely to be concerned of being a victim of crime compared to their male counterparts. This was 62% of female respondents compared to 50% of men. So it goes back to the comments by Rachel and Susan, how, you know, and Heidi, that we do need to reclaim our streets and actually start feeling safer again. Just based on the statistics alone, we know what our priorities are in Newham, and that's active travel, air quality and creating safer streets in the borough. And this is what we've done since declaring climate emergency in 2019. We've directed all our efforts into improving air quality and promoting safe, active travel. As women, we know we have different travel patterns to men, and therefore our policies address this disparity and create women-friendly, but also friendly for everyone streets. Firstly, our healthy school streets. We've currently got 11 school streets in place, and we have another 3 to be implemented next week. We've already got 30 schools interested in phase 3, and with new interests submitted from schools practically every day. The first pilot of the scheme has shown a real success, with almost 32% reduction in nitrogen dioxide in the morning and 16% reduction in the afternoon. And so not only does that prove that it's reduced air pollution, but actually created a safer neighborhood and safer street for children and mothers to walk their children to school. I'm really pleased to say that, you know, our parents have received the healthy school streets very positively. Our low traffic neighbourhoods similarly reduce the traffic, the volume of traffic that's going down their streets. In Stratford, air quality monitoring data already shows that over the last 2 years, there's been an average reduction of 24% in nitrogen dioxide. And we know that these measures work. And Browning Road Bridge closure in Newham, which shares a border with the London Borough of Redbridge, we've seen an average air pollution reduction of 28%. And a reduction of traffic volume of 63%, creating a safer place for people to walk down to access their essential services. We've invested almost £1 million in improving street lighting, which is actually very key. Our resident survey found that 72% of women felt unsafe outside, while 54% of men felt the same. We've made these changes to make walking, cycling and moving within the borough safer at night, or just when it gets dark, which could be as early as 4 o'clock during the winter seasons. And lastly, or ultimately, in Newham, we've committed to building 15-minute neighbourhoods. This is the commitment that every resident is able to access essential services within 15 minutes of walking or cycling from their home. This is a part of a wider borough regeneration strategy, which is actually focused on the whole borough and not just Stratford and Royal Docks, which is traditionally the main focus for development. 15-minute boroughs are most likely to benefit women who travel within neighbourhoods to access their local amenities rather than going into the city, and it would actually reduce the reliance on cars and the associated pollution. We will launch our first and the country's first ever Standing Citizens Assembly, which will actually give residents the power to decide what 15-minute neighbourhoods look like. So that's going back to what we discussed about taking the community with us. Yes, we want to create open and safe streets, but it has to reflect the local community. Given the diverse population of Newham, this could look like anything, and it could be very different from the north to the south of the borough. And lastly, to encourage people to take up cycling as an alternative, sustainable mode of transport, we've actually partnered with Brompton Bikes to have 6 stopping stations with 8 bikes each in the last year. And Newham actually offers free cycling sessions for everyone, adults and children, to improve their bike skills. And we know the tough position TfL is in, but we've been working with TfL to improve our cycling sites and corridors to improve manoeuvre around the borough. I think I'd like to conclude on this point that I'm not sure whether people are aware of Newham, but 10 years ago, we were in a very, very different position where there was no real push for active travel or even air monitoring air quality data. So I'm really pleased to say that I'm part of the administration that's taken a very active approach to promoting cycling, but also putting the community back in the heart of design and creating neighbourhoods. It's been a very truly transformative few years for me, and I'm looking forward to being part of movements just like this, where we're looking at, creating a better, inclusive neighbourhood and a safer future for all of us in the city. So that's all from me.
Brilliant, thank you. Really, really good to hear so much about what's going on in Newham and all the really brilliant work you're doing. So thank you for that. I'm quite conscious of time. I want to try and make sure that we've got 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the end. So I'm going to ask both Layla and Rowena, who I've still got down to speak, to be as succinct as possible in their remarks, and then I'll move to questions. So over to Layla Ben Hassel from Croydon Council, who I think is the chair of the Scrutiny Subcommittee for Streets, Homes and Environment there. Layla.
Thank you, Heidi, and great to be with you. I'll be as quick as possible. In addition to that, I'm also Vice Chair of Planning, so I'll be talking about that a little bit. So really, I see my role as a local ward councillor really to amplify women's voices and their perception in my day-to-day role. In terms of political leadership, I think we have to try and change the minds also of the police. So my community ward panels, you have female police officers that say, oh, why is this woman crossing that park? She knows she shouldn't, etc. Well, why should women, add 15 minutes on a cold winter's day to get home just because her park doesn't feel safe? So it's really important to champion in our role perceptions, even from, fellow women, about the importance of perception of safety and the importance to improve that. There is the Safer Streets Fund from the Home Office, and we are currently in Croydon running a questionnaire. So in my own ward, I will engage with female residents to engage with them and find out what makes them feel safer, so we can bid from this Home Office fund and get some capital investment. Planning, is very important. So you need to make sure you have the right mix of units, particularly on the ground floor. So you encourage passive surveillance. And that's something that people don't think about. They just focus on design. They don't think of what's going to be on the ground floor. So you as a woman sitting on planning committee, you can really help change and shape the public realm and the impact of planning on the public realm to make the area safer for women. Typical thing as well is cantilevered balconies. A lot of balconies are overhanging the footway and they end up with massive pillars on the footway, which if you're walking late at night, you can't see if anyone's hiding behind those fat columns. And it's about improving line of sight and not encroaching on them. Accessible amenity space. In Croydon, we have a very varied topography, particularly in the south, and a lot of 3 to 4 story units don't necessarily have lifts. It's about championing lifts for accessibility, but also making sure that the amenity space is accessible, and not just accessible by steps, because they don't think often that a woman will have, or a parent may have a child in a pushchair as well as a child walking with her. So we can't just have just steps leading to amenity space. So it's about always thinking about these things, and also we embrace the minimum car parking planning policy. And one thing I often do at planning committee is make sure that we prioritize car parking spaces for the use of families that are family units that are planned in that block. In my role of scrutiny, I champion a lot of data-led evidence approach to the policy changes, because we've all seen the LTN and how divided the debate has been. And I think having a data-led approach is one way to calm down the debate instead of seeing every policy change as a referendum. So we need to move away from traditional consultation mode and do more co-design approaches and being evidence-based in the decisions that we made. But you also need to stay strong. So usually the louder voices will tell you take everything down. I'm proud to say in Croydon we are maintaining our LTNs. What we are focusing on instead is improving the way we engage with our residents. The other thing in my role of scrutiny I try to do is break down silos, because you've got walking strategies, cycling strategies, play strategies that they're in different departments, etc. And it's making sure that everybody's working and talking to each other, so that we keep a holistic approach where our voices is heard equally across all aspects of strategy development. I would also encourage anyone to champion and push for lighting strategies. In my daytime, as my day job, I work in the City of London. I'm very proud of our lighting strategy. It's about creating the right type of lighting for the right areas. The danger is you often have areas that are overly lit, and then enter into areas that are very dark. And that transition creates an uneasy feeling and anxious feelings. And by having the right type of lighting that is more atmospheric instead of, utilitarian, and create an identity is a lot more calming and reassuring for women walking the streets. Improving footway, we've talked about it, but one thing that I think is really important in our political leadership is it's a bit boring, but highways maintenance plans, if you ask for them, you'll notice they're very, very overly focused on maintaining the carriageway. And so what I do in my royal scrutiny is making sure they rebalance that with resourcing, repairs and maintenance of the footways. Practical things you can do: speak to your residents to introduce CPZ to reduce overspill parking, so that you don't have as much encroachment on the footway. Try to work with your community groups and fundraise for these crossings that are informal, where you just paint the crossing in a very bright color. That tend to calm vehicle down. If you don't have capital investment, it's something you can do very easily. Make sure you organize female cycling in your area to build that confidence, and organize cycling training. And try to work with your residents to put any public art where you can, because usually if you speak to police architecture liaison, they will tell you it's proven if you have public art in areas, it contributes to enhance the feeling of safety. So I will stop here. There were other things I wanted to say, but I'll stop here. Thank you.
Lovely, Leila. Thank you ever so much. It was a really good, broad perspective into some of the sort of wider issues that impact on this area as well. I just want to check with the speakers, if people are okay, I plan to just run this event on for another 10 minutes, just because I'd quite like to hear from Rowena, and then I'd like to give people 10 minutes to ask questions as well. So that's my intention. Perhaps people can let me know if they've got any objection, or let Catherine or Chris know if they got any objection to that, but that's the plan. So Rowena, I'll come to you quickly. Rowena is the executive member for Environment and Transport at Islington Council, who have been doing lots of brilliant work in that part of London as well. So over to Rowena.
Thank you. I will try to be quick. I think I just wanted to say a little bit tonight about actually how quickly you can change things. I know COVID came and it gave us a real opportunity. It was awful challenges, but it gave us a real opportunity because people were prepared to look at their streets differently. They've been out and about, they've been using green spaces, but actually equally they've been using their community space. And it was absolutely clear that there was a real demand for people to actually be able to expand back into their spaces. Reduction in traffic, about 40% of normal traffic levels allowed them to do that. And then, as lockdown increased, traffic increased. So we're basically talking really about the COVID response, which was supported by TfL and actually the government statutory guidance in May, saying that the streets need to be reallocated, space needs to be allocated for walking and cycling. And that was the basis of what we were doing. Previously, we had been looking at it and we were very concerned. We talk about data. We have a tiny borough in Islington, very, very dense. There were still 278 million miles were driven through our borough in 2019. And that's 24.3 million more miles driven in 2019 than 2013. It's a 10% increase, which is huge. And there was no indication that was tailing off. The other side of that was only 5% of trips were cycled. And we reckon that's 13% of the potential number of trips that could be cycled. And we know who was doing that. People who actually are prepared to take risks, and they're not women with children. They're not people with mobility issues. They're often very fit people who can keep up with the speed of traffic, because we know that if you can cycle at the speed of traffic, you don't get abused so much. You don't get close past so much, and it's a real, it's a real situation for many, many people. The pandemic hit, and we thought TfL modelling was showing that more and more people were going to get into cars. In Islington, only about 70% of households have access to a car, but we know that many, many more have driving licenses. So potentially we were looking at a real shift from public transport, from cycling and from walking into cars. And that was incredibly worrying, because we know that has a road danger, absolutely stops people from using more sustainable methods of transport. We know that, if you don't have a high income, you are not going to be able to get into a car, even if you wanted to do that. So there was a real equality and fairness issue. Coming out of COVID, built on top of the equality and fairness issue that was before COVID, because we know the higher income you've got, the more likely you are to have a car. But we also we called it people-friendly streets. I mean, people mentioned that, and that's because we wanted to see it as more than just a traffic problem. It's about community space. We wanted to make the areas safer, quieter, healthier, and calmer. So people could travel, people could walk, people could cycle, but actually people just use their spaces for chatting. Just very quickly. We have a fantastic set of officers at the council, actually a lot of women transport planners, which is really interesting, who absolutely were really keen to do this. So what we first did, we thought, right, what do we have to do? We have to be very, very, very clear that we aren't going to say we are going to support you to get into cars. What we have to do is the opposite. We are going to support you to walk. We're going to support you to cycle. We are going to support you to wheel. Between July and January of this year, we brought in 7 LTNs, and that's new LTNs cover 23% of the borough, and they're areas that are now connected to the LTNs in Hackney. And we've got some cycle routes that are connected to cycle routes in Hackney, but also in Camden. So there's now a swathe across Hackney, Islington, and Camden where you have got safer corridors for travelling, but also safer spaces for people just to be. We brought in 22 school streets, which is pretty much got a few more primary schools to go, but that's pretty much all the primary schools that we can do relatively easily. And that, as you know, as colleagues have been saying, that's a real benefit to those people who are trying to travel to school, and also incentive to travel to school. Sorry, low traffic neighbourhoods. We did them under experimental traffic orders. That's clearly not how we were intending to do them. We were intending to do the co-design, but actually we couldn't have done that and get these in. I will speed up a little bit. And I think people talk about data monitoring. So we have just started our monitoring. We are going to do 12-month consultations, which is how we are going to engage residents in the debate. We put them in, people can experience them, and then we're having 12-month consultations. We're beginning to get the monitoring reports back, and that very, very clearly shows within the low traffic neighbourhoods, significant reductions in traffic, and actually really crucially significant reductions in the speed of cars going through that area. But at the moment, no significant impact on the main roads as well, which is, I think, for many people a big worry. It's been very tough. We've had demonstrations, we've had lots of social media abuse, but actually the best thing to do, I found, was actually when it's getting a bit down, when it gets down, which it does sometimes, you get people emailing you all the time, just actually go and stand in one of these neighbourhoods and just experience what you've got. You've got tiny children cycling. You've got people who would never describe themselves as cyclists from all backgrounds, just moving around. But equally, you've got people using mobility aids, just walking the streets. People with buggies and fathers and mothers with buggies just walking around and relaxed. And it's so relaxed, much more than if you go out onto the main roads. And I think just would say, though, that's not to say we're ignoring pavements. We're going to start people-friendly pavements. And also, and I think, again, was something that people were saying, actually how you change space by doing other things like greening. So that's a project we've got on at the moment. So yeah, it's an amazing project. It was COVID awful, but it has given us a real opportunity to reimagine our streets and actually to start doing something about it.
Thank you, Rowena, and thank you for your leadership in this as well, because I know that some of the debates have been quite ferocious around all of this, and I totally agree with you about actually going out and experiencing the change that really has been brought about in some of the neighbourhoods where it's happened is just quite striking, really. Okay, I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and I'm going to select some questions to put to different members of the panel. I'll start with the first one for Rachel, which is, Rachel, you talked about the school run data showing that twice as many women are doing the school run. What does this data mean for how we should go about tackling this problem?
Thanks, Heidi. I had a sort of quick go at answering that in the chat, but I can add something else, which is also relevant. So some of the things that I found quite interesting relate to other modes of transport. And for instance, looking at public transport, and there's quite an interesting literature on how public transport traditionally has served radial routes into the centre rather than orbital routes. And potentially there's an assumption that people have workplaces and have, their shopping facilities in the centre, but from people from different communities, their workplaces may be somewhere else at the edge of town, their shopping shopping centres may not be in that centre, they may be somewhere else. So, you know, having radial public transport routes can be exclusionary in terms of the destination that they serve if you don't have orbital routes. So I think there's lots of things to think about in terms of planning, not just area level initiatives and, you know, looking at the equity of how those are distributed, but also routes, what destinations, what types of trips are served, because there's a lot of things that you might not think could be exclusionary, but that are when you look more closely at destinations and what kind of trips people want to make.
Yeah, okay, that's really good, thank you. I'm getting rapid fire messages from Catherine, who's trying to filter questions for me on my WhatsApp, which is all proving a little bit difficult. I can see that I've got a really good question for Layla, actually, which is how can we influence our councillors and officers to stop seeing change as something which needs a referendum approach? How can we encourage them to use community co-design? How do we get across that consulting on designs, once the engineers have gone through many iterations and drawn up a design, it's too late to be inclusive and hear the needs of users? Layla, I don't know whether you want to say anything on that, and perhaps some of the other councillors might have a view that they want to express. Layla?
Yeah, I mean, it's all about political leadership, and if you are alone, it's going to be harder if you have more councillors with you who say the same thing. I mean, even in minority groups, for some reason, I don't think it would come up so much from the Tory side, but I think it's the wrong perception that if you take too much time, I mean, what I've found is if you take too much, if you do engage, there's this notion that it will take time and it will slow everything down. And what I try to explain is actually if you do it from the start, you get your mandate quicker and you save time further down the line. So how residents can champion that? Well, as a resident or a Labour member, I would say more, is get involved in your manifesto and push for those design approaches to be ingrained in your manifesto and lobby your cabinet member. So I tend to ask members to write to our cabinet members so that I'm not the only one saying that. I'm backed up with a number of members who are saying the same thing as me, to try and change that perception. And the problem is if you are in a council that is very officer-led and not so politically led, how you change that culture is very hard. But I do think that through the scrutiny process, you can write, if you Google for your own local authority, you can write to the scrutiny chairs and ask them, because scrutiny is there to enhance policy development. And you know, if you bombard your scrutiny chairs, get a group of you to say we want this for this policy, we want this approach for this policy, then they should be raising it and encourage officers to go down that route. So that's the two things that I can think about. But I think it's down to political leadership and policy approach, and that's why we need members in the Labour Party to champion those approaches.
Thanks, Layla. Did anyone else want to mention anything? If you just come off your microphone, I can bring you in. Let's take Eve and then Niloufer. Eve.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there about the leadership. I think really demonstrating the difference it makes. You know, so we know that change moves at the speed of trust. Absolutely. If you invest the time at the beginning and take people with you, you're more likely to get there. And I think highlighting where we go wrong when we don't do that, and showing people the experiences of when you do it and you do it well. Because the problem is often it's been done and it's been done badly in that very paternalistic kind of style of a sort of, we're going to tell you in a village hall, and you know, we then wonder why you then get sort of shouted at and frustrated, as opposed to facilitating a good kind of deliberative conversation around what we want and actually listening to people and really listening to people about what matters to them. So I think as soon as you start sharing, and I spend a lot of time just sharing those pictures and those positive stories on Twitter, etc., because then I've had my colleagues go, oh, that looks good, or that sounds like, you know, suddenly it looks energizing, it looks positive. They want to do the same and they want to be part of that. So showing the positive experiences.
Yeah, really good point. Niloufer.
Thank you. Actually, just going off on what Councillor Aldred said, it's actually sharing the right messages and sharing good news. You know, being a local councillor actually holds a very, very important responsibility of taking decisions that actually can have severe impact on people's lives, whether that's a good impact or, you know, or a bad one. But we make very tough decisions, and they're not easy decisions to make. Even if it's for Newham, we've got a very car dominating culture, so introducing a charge to a parking permit evoked a mass protest, but it was a decision we needed to take. And I think simply being brave, just being a brave councillor, being able to have those difficult conversations and actually get your messaging right, have a good reason for why you're introducing that policy, and stick by your decisions. That would be my way of kind of bringing the local community with us.
Brilliant, thank you. I think Susan has probably already tried to answer this question in the chat, but I'm conscious that not everyone will have seen the chat, so I'm going to ask it here. Susan, question for you. There is a mass colonisation of pavements by electric charging infrastructure heading our way as councils scramble to install the infrastructure and slide into the easy approach of pavement rather than road. What can be done about this? It feels like all the relevant organisations are just watching this happen.
Yes, I share those concerns. I'm absolutely of the view that electric vehicle charging posts should not be placed on the footway unless it is an exceptionally wide footway, which most are not. I think they should be placed in the road. We've seen some examples this week of ones in Widnes where they were placed on a wide footway, but right in the middle. So not only is it obstructing the footway, but you have the trip hazard from the cable as well. And one of the things I'm really keen to see but haven't is sort of the idea of recharge parklets. So you actually put the charger in the road, but you create a parklet around it, which then you could include some seating. If you've got the power coming to that space for the vehicle, why not put in some mobile phone charging? Why not put in some electric cycle top-up charging for cargo bikes? Put in some greenery and actually make it a facility that benefits everybody. Yes, it does mean taking out a parking space, but putting in an electric vehicle charging bay is taking out a parking space. So I think there are different ways to do it. I think putting it in the footway is the lazy approach and the wrong approach, and it shouldn't happen. And we have seen examples that have gone in and have had to be taken out again, which is a huge waste of money. So I think we need to be more creative. If any of the councillors, I would love to see a recharge parklet created. It hasn't been done yet, but I think that would be a great way of actually bringing benefits to everybody.
There's a challenge that Susan set for the councillors on the call this evening. I've got another one for Eve actually, which is a sort of we've had a lot of contributions from London, so I do want to ask this one. Funding outside of London with public transport being so expensive, how do we get people out of their cars?
Yeah, really good question. And I'm really pleased that in Greater Manchester, obviously we're now taking back control of our buses. And I think going back to the point that Rachel said before, it's actually key in terms of our active travel as well, for all the reasons that were pointed to. We know that buses, public transport, are more used by again women, by older women, young women, by people who don't have access to cars. So I think that investment is critical actually. It's really critical for us in Greater Manchester as a whole, if we're going to continue to be able to really make accelerated progress in car reduction and increasing sustainable active travel. So I guess it's a play. I wish the government was listening. You know, if they really talk about levelling up, I would say that's the one key thing to do, is help us create green, sustainable, accessible buses. And that network that we can integrate, which is what we're looking to do. Because we also know to get on the bus, you're going to have to walk, wheel or cycle to get there. It completely changes the whole conversation. And I think it really helps reframe it for people that still don't see the link between active travel and safe streets and social justice and in climate justice. And I think it really helps to create that picture. So it's critical, to be honest. It's absolutely critical, and I hope we can make that change. And I think the one other thing I would say is I hope in that moment of reset and redesign, we also go that step further in going how are buses designed. I've had some brilliant conversations again around let's not just roll out the same type of buses as well, because trying to avoid that conflict between wheelchair users and people with buggies, making them so you've got lower windows that kids can look out, how to make that all joyful as well, and not just about speed and distance.
All really great points, Eve. I'm very conscious of the time and that we're coming up we've actually just reached 6:10 now, and I did say that I would extend the event for 10 minutes because I knew that there were lots of questions. I'm aware that there are lots of questions in the chat that I haven't been able to put to the panel, and this probably just means that at some point in the future, Labour Cycles are going to have to organise another event so that we can continue the conversation, because it's been a really uplifting discussion actually, and it's great to be part of a panel, an all-female lineup where we've got such positive things to say about how things could be better and could be different, and to see women in local government particularly actually leading that change. So can I bring this to a close, say thank you to everyone, to all the panelists for some brilliant contributions. Thank you to those that have joined for your questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get through more of them, and a big thank you to Labour Cycles for putting it together. So see you all soon, hopefully. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Well done, Catherine.
Thanks, guys.